at the Civil Service Board site for the city, and I'll have the agenda for December 3rd.
All right, we have started the stream in the background. We're live now.
Okay.
We'll still give for any members of the public watching, we're waiting on technical issues, waiting on a member to join. We should be starting shortly.
Mike still has not received the link yet, he said.
I just sent it to him with the email address that I have had for him. So unless his email address has changed.
Can you text me his email, Alan? I'll see if, his email, and I'll see if I can send it.
Let me see.
If you can just text it to me, because we're streaming live.
I understand. Let me see if I have it.
Okay.
Hold on. Did you get it? Yes, that should be it. Okay, can you jump on now? You just got your email.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, good. You're good then, right? Okay.
Hey, Mike.
How are you?
Okay. Is everybody ready to get started? Okay, it is 2:38 on Thursday, December 5th. And I'd call the December meeting of the Asheville Civil Service Board to order. Take a call of the roll. Mr. Devereaux?
Yes, I'm here.
Mr. Eskovitz?
Present.
Mr. Hahn?
Here.
Mr. Webb?
Here.
And I'm here, Carol Goins, the chair. So we have a quorum of all board members. I will ask, did everybody have a chance to review the agenda?
Yes. Yeah.
I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda as printed.
I so move. Alan Eskovitz.
I'll second Carter Webb.
It's been moved and seconded. We proceed with the agenda as set out. All in favor, let it be known by saying aye.
Aye.
I'm sorry, you do have to do the roll call for all of them.
Oh, I did that.
Yes, you roll called everybody into the meeting, which is.
Okay. I'm sorry. Okay. All right. All in favor, let it be known by saying aye. Mr. Devereaux.
Aye.
Mr. Eskovitz.
Aye.
Mr. Hahn.
Aye.
Mr. Webb.
Aye.
Then I vote aye. So the agenda is approved. Has everyone had an opportunity to review the minutes of our last meeting?
Yes.
Then I will entertain a motion to accept the minutes as prepared.
I move that the minutes be accepted. in the last meeting, prior meeting. Alan Eskovitz, I'm sorry.
Mr. Eskovitz has moved approval of the minutes. Is there a second?
I'll second Carter Webb.
And Mr. Webb has seconded. All in favor, let it be known by saying aye. Mr. Devereaux,
Aye.
Mr. Eskovitz,
Aye.
Mr. Hahn,
Aye.
Mr. Webb,
Aye.
and I vote aye as well. Are there any updates or reports? Okay, hearing none, I assume no. So we'll move into, is there any, the unfinished business, which is the discussion of the substantive rules. Did everyone have an opportunity to look at the, I guess the second draft or the update of the rules that were provided by our city attorney since our last meeting?
Yes, mic on.
Okay. Excuse me. Does anyone have any comments or thoughts or these are, I think, slightly different from our last meeting.
I guess I'd request maybe John Henning and John Maddox just provide maybe a little brief summary about the sort of deliberations that happened between the city and between John Henning. I mean, I think we're kind of familiar with that, but it might help just to prime the pump a little bit.
Okay. Mr. Maddox?
Certainly. Y'all are familiar with the film Mad Max Goes in a Thunderdome, 2 Enter, 1 Leave. It was a lot like that. John and I worked together on this. Mr. Henning and I had a very productive conversation. We talked around some of the concerns that the board identified at the last meeting we had on these, and that those conversations, as well as pulling in some feedback that we previously received from some of the employment groups. This resulted in a couple of changes. I'd be glad to go through here, and John, if I miss anything, please feel free to jump in. Going down the list here, Mr. Henning had originally proposed adding in a definition of appeal, so that as it was used in this rule, it would say what an appeal is. I decided to actually make it unnecessary to have to define what an appeal is by just wherever the rule referred to appeal, which was 2 places, just make it clear that rather than having to have a separate definition, it just dealt with the complaint of employment action or something like that. So there was no need to have a separate definition of appeal in this rule. One place where we talked about extensively was around this idea of constructive termination. Mr. Henning had previously talked about, the board talked about how they wanted to leave an avenue open for employees who resign from their employment to still come before the Civil Service Board and plead some form of constructive termination. You'll notice that this version is not changed. The city stands pretty steadfast in its belief that an employee who resigns their employment, and that deprives this board of jurisdiction over their claim. Getting into discussions about constructive termination leaves just too big of a window for employees to resign and then also come before the Civil Service Board, and that's something that the city feels pretty strongly about. So of course, this board is free to pass the rule differently if they like, or to amend this rule change and then leave the final decision on that to the city council. But I do believe that, and the city's of strong opinion, that these rules are supposed to be fairly black line, and you're trying not to leave too many windows to crawl through these to get around these rules, or to bring things before the board that are not very clearly before the board. If somebody's fired, they're very clearly before the board. If somebody resigns, they're very clearly not before the board under these rules. And I think that kind of bright line rule serves this board and serves the city and ultimately serves the employees very well because it makes their choices very, very clear at the outset. So that was one area where Mr. Henning and I discussed it, but in the end, this is where the city is kind of standing pat on this. John,
unless board members, let me just share my opinion on that matter with you. I do. I thank Mr. Maddox for his cage match with me. He is a dirty fighter. So I'll just cut you up. Bringing the chair in was just that wasn't fair. But we did have a lot of discussion about this. I think it's one of the more contentious points we still I see in the whole matter. I feel like the law would support and the way that analogous, we don't have any courts of appeal or Supreme Court review of the question. It would be a question of first impression about whether or not the Civil Service Act would encompass your review of a termination that is a resignation that's involuntary. There are analogous laws that are fairly similar in their setup, like the State Human Resources Act sets up now there's one major difference, which is that the state has to prove just cause. And we know specifically the courts have told us that the justification that is referred to in the Civil Service Act does not mean just cause. That's something a little bit higher in terms of the standard of proof that the employer has to provide in that case. But what is analogous is the State Human Resources Act does not speak to resignation. The word resignation doesn't appear in it, just as it doesn't appear in the Civil Service Act. But what the courts have told us is that if an employee who falls under that act resigns under circumstances that are involuntary, in other words, they're told you will be fired if you don't resign, you can resign. In that circumstance, the state as employer still has to prove that it has what you would call justification for the city under the Civil Service Act. So, under state law, the state is put upon to prove that it had that just cause. I don't think it's too much to ask that the city under the same circumstances, with one proviso I'm going to give you in a second, also prove that it would have had justification for a dismissal. And I understand the city's position that they bargain for and get from an employee who resigns the surety that they are not going to pursue some kind of appeal, but the same is true of the state of North Carolina. And I think if we don't end up with that as a rule, I do think that it would still be best if we could agree with the city administration about how they're going to go about securing resignations in a way that maybe makes clear to an employee that they know they're giving up the right to come before the Civil Service Board, and in a way that could put all of your minds at ease that employee rights are being fully explained to them and vetted. And I know from talking to John that is the intent of city administration. And finally, I'll just say that I do feel like in the Buchanan matter that came before this board several years ago, it was appealed on to Superior Court. And in the Superior Court, what the judge ended up saying on an initial motion to dispose of the matter was that it wasn't right for review in Superior Court yet, because this board had said, we have an employee who says, I was told resign or be fired. She did resign. That's as good as a dismissal under the case. So it remains to this board to figure out whether it's justified under the act. So it's still my recommendation that you keep the language that I propose for you. I fully expect that and I'm going to lay out for the city an explanation for the city council about why we feel like as a board, if it's your will to keep it in there, that we feel like that's appropriate. Alan, you have a question?
Yeah, and I was just going to comment on or add to what you were saying, John. So you're finish your thought. I'm sorry.
I just to finish would say we do it with the knowledge that it is in the Civil Service Act, that it is the city council's purview once this board has propounded a rule to make adjustments to it before it's finally adopted. And so you can see that there will be a tension of ideas as to what should be in the final rule that will be up to the city council to make a final determination. Yes, Alan.
I'm wondering, what about a situation where the employee finds the work environment so hostile that it's tantamount to a forced resignation? In other words, they really feel that there is no other option other than to resign because of the work environment itself. And that would fall, and that would create a situation where there is a constructive termination. And I think that should be recognized somehow to give fair balance to the employee also. John, Henning?
Alan, I would say that, I mean, if it's the will of the board to put that into a proposed rule, I certainly will help you find language that does it. I tend to agree with the city that some limit around what kind of constructive termination can actually come before this board is needed. I think that I can draw a really straight line between the city says you will be fired if you don't go on and resign, and justification under the Civil Service Act. I share the city's concern, and I tend to agree that if you open it up to the boss looked at me cross-eyed and I felt like I had to quit, and now that was a hostile work environment. I don't think that's really spelled out within the act. I do think you pretty quickly outside of the scope, the clear scope of what's in the act. There is also a forum for somebody who claims that the hostile work environment was because of some characteristic of theirs. In other words, a discrimination claim. They've got a venue for that, and we're not it. So
that's right.
And I think so. If it helps you, correct. If it helps you to know that, somebody in that circumstance who claims, well, it's just such a terrible environment there, I felt like I had to quit. They can have their day if they can make a case, and they don't have to make it in front of you.
Understood.
So I think Mr. Henning has very astutely pointed out that we have a difference of opinion here where the city wants to see, and how Mr. Henning thinks to advise you on that. And I think as he has not misstated the state of the law even a little bit. I completely agree with him that is the current state of the law in North Carolina. I would like to point out, though, that other municipalities in dealing with their workforce do not have civil service boards. Most other municipalities, this is a special thing. We're not the state. The state has a state employment act that applies to state employees. And other municipalities do not have these kinds of restrictions on how they handle their workforces. Within Buncombe County, the sheriff's office, when they want to discipline an employee or separate employment with an employee, they don't have these kinds of hurdles that they have to jump through. So the city feels that a narrow construction of jurisdiction is more appropriate here when this is a sort of extraordinary remedy that applies only to the city of Asheville. Now, I will say that Mr. Henning's right. Our employees are well informed prior to making a decision to resign. That's something that we do our damnedest to make sure that they know their rights. I was in a meeting earlier this week explaining the employee really wanted to resign. As soon as he realized that was an option, I want to resign. I said, okay, hold on a second. I want you to make sure that you understand what that means. And I say, if you are fired, you have the ability to appeal this termination not only to the city manager, but to the Civil Service Board, then the Superior Court of Appeals, all the way up to the North Carolina Supreme Court. If you resign, then And if you're fired, the fact that you were fired is a public record. And the letter that we give you stating the reasons for your termination is a public record. If you resign, you lose those Civil Service Board appeal rights. You lose all your rights under the Civil Service Act. However, you are able to go to an employer and say, in all honesty, that you resigned your employment and there's no record out there, public record made, that you were terminated. So there's value there. And we do our damnedest to make sure that employees understand that. So I feel like by foreclosing constructive termination here, it's clear and we're able to proceed as an employer in a way that everybody knows the rules up front. And we're not having people take second bites at the apple where they resign their employment and then they decide they want to go to the Civil Service Board, which is we have had happen in other cases.
Vice Mayor Whistler, you had a comment?
I'm sorry. I just, John Maddox, can you, is that procedure, the procedure where, you tell the employee, is that written down someplace? Do we have the employee recognize that differential in writing? To maybe give the Civil Service Board some more assurance that process, that you make it very clear, here's what you're getting, here's what you're giving up. Can you just help the board maybe understand how the city has obligated themselves to make that distinction clear to an employee?
I will say that we're hoping to standardize that more has been a part of this broader push to update the city's policies that has been ongoing for the past, I know that I've been real involved with that effort for about a year now, but about a year ago, we all went on lockdown, I'm sad to say. So that's really thrown a wrench in that. However, I would love to see in the future that before any employee resigns their employment, that they're given a form that explains these rights to them. So it's not me having to be in quite so many meetings to explain these rights to them. I'm certainly fine with that. And I know Shannon's right here and she can tell you that I think that's something that HR strives to do. Some of the time, it all seems very clear cut in your hypotheticals, but when you've got employees who are unwilling to engage with management or unwilling to talk with HR or not willing to engage, they're hard to get a hold of. Sometimes it's hard to make sure that they're fully informed before they make these decisions. So there's not a cookie cutter resignation, termination decision. We try as best we can, but that's why I say that to say that somebody has an absolute right that we're going to do this every single time. And I don't want to make something that black letter as far as an obligation. Usually it's possible. I will say sometimes it's not. When you say that's the case, Shannon, to fully inform somebody that way?
Yes, I would agree that we make every effort to make sure employees understand. And between HR and legal, we reiterate that. But to John's point, sometimes there are unique circumstances where it is difficult to have a conversation with an employee or to make sure that they do understand. And we're certainly open to suggestions and can work with legal as we continue to work on our policies to have a more formalized approach to that.
So, and as I'm trying to point out, Civil Service Board members, I do think that there is if you do not end up with a rule that says an involuntary resignation is something that falls before your purview, I think that there are fallback positions that can make that truly fall within your realm of ensuring the more efficient and fair administration of the civil service, and it's best for the city too to streamline and be a part of assisting with processes that make clear when somebody's resigned. They know what they have done. So that's still before you to do, even if you don't wind up with a rule that makes clear you have jurisdiction over a case like this. So one other thing I want to say about the language that I proposed there is that it is not meant to be, and I don't think it's drafted as a free-for-all backdoor, you can absolutely resign your employment and waltz into the Civil Service Board and then try to undo it all. It says that if somebody does resign, it is presumptively a voluntary resignation, and they have to prove, it puts a further burden on the employee of showing that there's a direct cause between I was told that I would be fired and I chose to resign, but I was given no other choice. So I just want to make clear that I don't, it's not certainly not intended to be a wide open window.
One question I've got, when employees, are they, this is kind of maybe a bad question or poor question, but are employees really aware of the Civil Service Board? I mean, it's such a unique, they are, Shannon shaking her head. Yeah, so they most, I mean, you would say a large portion of city employees know what the Civil Service Board does and what their rights are with the Civil Service Board.
I'm sure there's exceptions to the rule, but
sure.
Generally, it's been my experience that they are very, 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 very well aware of the Civil Service Board, and that being a hurdle that the city might have to jump over in order to end somebody's employment.
Are there any other questions or comments?
So
in reference to this section or other suggestions and comments, I mean, I guess Mr. Maddox is going to continue with the other changes, or are we going to continue on this?
Whatever you would like to comment on.
I just was making sure we weren't closing anything. So.
And Madam Chair, I do think if John Maddox wants to go on to the next thing, there are a couple other areas where we, he beat me down on an agreement about language through our cage match.
Spin that chair, yeah.
Mr. Estevez, did you have a question or comment?
I don't know if John's going through, are you going to discuss other sections?
Yeah.
Or section, okay, point by point?
That was just one.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry, then I'll step in.
But that was actually probably the hardest one. I think the rest of them are going to be relatively easy. The next ones that the next change that I see that John and I discussed, this was an improvement suggested by Mr. Henning. I know we got two Johns, it's just bothersome that way. We get down to the definition of entitled. It talks about to whether to be, an employee has a right to an appeal a denial of promotion or raise in pay to which the employee is entitled. Well, here we have an absolute right for promotion or to a position within the classified service. So that's the change right there, to a position within the classified service. You'll remember we had a hearing where somebody was grieving not getting promoted to a position outside the classified service. And this makes clear that it's only to positions within the classified service. That's one change. Or a raise in pay automatically due an employee based on time and service, achievement of certification, or placement on a ranked eligibility list. So the change there is achievement of certification. We have some employees or some positions that, I think primarily in the fire department, that upon obtaining some, you're hazmat certified, or you obtain some sort of medical certification, that comes with a raise in pay. And if that is something that they're automatically entitled to, that would be a raise in pay to which they are entitled. And if they do not receive it, if they're entitled to that under city policy and they do not receive it, then that would be something that would come before this board's jurisdiction. And that was a suggestion, Mr. Henning. I think it's very, very well met. And that's the next change. The next one that is sorry, do you have a question, Al?
Well, actually, I'd like to go back to B4, due process.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't mind, we didn't discuss this, or you didn't review this. I have a question about the disciplinary matrix that's referred to in B4. And that is, it's my understanding that the matrix has not been formally approved by the APD, number one. So it's not been actually signed on by the chief. And secondly, because it is a new policy or procedure, it should be brought before the Civil Service Board and approved by us, then it should go into the language of this document. But since the disciplinary matrix is not in place yet with APD, then I'm not sure if we can actually approve this document until the chief has been before us with that new policy.
Well, first of all, you absolutely can go ahead and pass this even if the chief has not passed off on a departmental policy yet. The fact of the matter is, I spoke with Chief Zach about an hour ago on this fact he couldn't be here today, but he wanted me to pass along this with regards to that. He has told the various employment unions or the various employee associations that he is completely in favor of a disciplinary matrix. And what's more is they can pick it. They can pick the disciplinary matrix, and he will, unless it's just so far afield, he will sign off on it and put it in place. So the fact that now, and that's also, I'm a little bit confused by the idea that this is something that would come before the Civil Service Board. This is not something that would fall under Civil Service Board's purview. You're welcome to review it, but it's not something that, it's not a promotional process or criteria that would fall under the Civil Service Board's review authority. Mr. Henning, am I correct on that? Am I missing something?
Is this a new policy or?
It's a policy, but you do not pass off on APD policy.
Yeah, I'm looking at the act itself, so bear with me just a second. I think in part, so Section 6 says the Civil Service Board shall have authority exercisable by any of its members to review and approve all promotional processes in the police and fire departments, and may review any promotional decision.
Right, that's something that the board has done. They've looked at promotional processes and reviewed them, but this is not what that is. A disciplinary matrix would not be a promotional process or criteria.
And Alan, I guess that's right. We have become accustomed to most every change in policy that, well, it's all the policies that are brought before the board to be reviewed and approved. But they have all been more like promotional or the, I mean, I guess you would, I don't know whether you'd really consider just sort of position classifications to be promotional necessirily, but
those are the criteria that they are able to review and approve.
It is true that it's not in the act as every, I mean, certainly you don't pass on every departmental policy. I mean, you wouldn't look at like I don't know, recording retention standards or something. Yeah, I guess I have to agree with that, Alan.
Okay.
So what I would say is disciplinary matrix is, and this is something that we would not want to hold up the board from passing on these rules here, because APD is yet to adopt a disciplinary matrix that the chief of police has said he's more than willing to put into place, especially since this would be holding up rules for the entire city based on just one department. In addition to that, given that the chief of police is so very willing to put this in place, City Council is not going to vote on this at its next meeting, which is on December the 8th. There's not time or enough to get it on the agenda. It would be January before the board or before the City Council could even take this matter up. And if need be, the City Council could make its adoption of that effective upon the APD's disciplinary matrix being put into place. Part of this is being held up because, as we noted last meeting, the PBA, who's been really in the mix on this and been really good partners on these rules and on these kinds of decisions, Rick Tullis is sadly still very ill, and we haven't been able to. I would want to have his input on any kind of disciplinary matrix that was put in place, because as Chief Sack noted, he told Rick that you guys pick it, I'll put it in place.
I also think, Alan, that to some extent the city, the toothpaste is out of the tube a little bit on disciplinary matrix once it's gotten into this rule. I mean, I think that there at least is some room for an employee to come before you and say, look, they didn't even adopt one and I didn't get any chance to prove that I didn't deserve this discipline. Because that's the purpose of the thing to begin with, right? Is showing an employee, you had plenty of notice, here, correct this. You didn't do it, we had to go to stage 2. You still didn't do it, we had to go to stage 3. Or you did something so bad that we had to jump all the way to stage 3 to begin with. I think as long as the notion that the city is headed toward disciplinary matrices for its departments is out there, it is at some exposure for argument that you can tell this is not a reasonable dismissal of me. And that's what the kind of argument you might hear as a board until the city does get around to adoption of those. So I think it's going to be in the city's best interest to go on and adopt one.
I guess my only concern was the fact that it had not been adopted to date and signed off by the chief, and the employees and APD employees have basically bought into the matrix concept. But as long as he says we're moving on that, I'll go with that.
And John's point is well taken that if the employee is disciplined in a department that does not utilize disciplinary matrix, they might say that is somehow depriving them of due process. But no, the disciplinary matrices are more routine in the law enforcement and possibly in the firefighter field. I don't believe they're so common when other departments, such as sanitation, public works, that sort of thing, where the range of possible misconduct is a little cloudier there. So, okay. Moving on.
And Alan, tell me if I'm wrong about this, but I feel pretty comfortable with the idea that, sanitation worker doesn't need a broad range of sort of, the job is what the job is. And as long as you, perform it reasonably well and don't engage in, some terrible personal conduct, you're probably going to be okay.
Agreed.
It's far more complicated, like law enforcement. That's where it makes sense to really minutely spell it all out.
Agreed.
So if we're good on that, if there's no more questions on that, I was going to move down here to this definition of suspension. So the board, y'all noted that previously, and this is based on old Civil Service Board rules and even a part of the city's current personnel ordinance, talks about a suspension is unpaid or involuntary leave of more than 10 consecutive work shifts. Well, y'all said, well, doesn't this raise some issues with the firefighters? And I said, well, when it comes to talking about firefighter pay issues and understanding some of these things, I need to talk to Chief Burnett. I spoke with Chief Burnett in the interim since your last meeting. I said, Civil Service Board raised this as a concern. He said, they're absolutely right. It is a concern. He said, if a firefighter loses 10 consecutive shifts, that's basically a month of work for them.
Right.
Whereas somebody else who loses 10 consecutive shifts, they're basically losing 2 weeks of work. Right. Two Monday through Friday cycles. So it does result in some inequities. So we talked about it. We thought the most equitable way to do this would be to make it 14 calendar day suspension. Then anything less than that is not going to be subject to Civil Service Board jurisdiction, but anything over that is going to count as a suspension for purposes of Civil Service Board jurisdiction. And I think that's going to be more equitable because you're basically going to be getting at a paycheck for somebody. And once you start to get at more than a paycheck, that's when you start to have something that this board should probably consider, whether it was equitable or not, whether it was proper, justified.
And I'm seeing all of my members nodding their heads. I'm comfortable with that unless you've got questions about it. But I think it gets at the concern and is a fair way to do it.
This has inspired us, and Shannon, we'll need to go through anywhere in our city policies and also the personnel ordinance. I think it talks about it in the context of pre-disciplinary conferences that talks about 10 shifts. So we'll need to change that and just put it on our to-do list. The next one was a big one, and there's a lot of, this is probably the main bit of discussion we had the last time that we met, and talked about what counts as a abuse of discretion standard. Remember before we had whether something was grossly unreasonable, illegal, or patently unreasonable, something like that. A lot of adjectives, and this board indicated that y'all were not as on board with those. So I've acquiesced, and the city has acquiesced, and we have backed off of that slightly. And you see that now under 4 there reads abuse of discretion shall mean a decision that's clearly unreasonable, erroneous, or arbitrary. And this is coming from a definition that I believe Mr. Henning found, and the city is agreeable to that. It's assuming the city council, I can't speak for the city council here, but I imagine they would be on board with that language.
The only thing that I would add is if you put a comma after erroneous, just to.
Oxford commas, come on.
Yeah.
It was Vampire Weekend.
Is that a Harvard comma?
That's right. That's right.
My comma.
Board members, I feel like this standard, and I have to point to Carter for actually found that language in some case law. I think it's a better fit for what your concerns were, because I do think the really kind of de minimis, guy gets a speeding ticket on his own time out of the town, city vehicle, and doesn't have anything to do with his employment. You could potentially find that's not it's an unreasonable basis for an outright dismissal, for example. So I think it gets us to where you were trying to go in terms of your review. Alan.
Question?
Alan?
Okay. Under C2, I have a question. And we've talked about this a little bit in the past. An employee violating any law. And I still feel that that's rather broad. And the violation could be so minor and yet could be used as a reason for dismissal. So I still have a problem with the terminology of any law. And in the same section of C2, received due process. Is this really just cause to justify dismissal? Receiving due process. I'm not sure. I'm just raising that, but the concern is on both sides, both with the language of any law, which may not even be related to the work environment, and then due process. How is that really defined there? Is that really just cause? So, John Henning, you may want to respond, and then John Maddox.
I'm happy to. I feel like, I was just getting at this. You got to put all of those sections together. Number 2 says what we're going to consider per se justified, but then it is explained further in 3, 4, and 5 about what exactly the city still has to show. And so I think, Alan, that the language we've landed on in number 4 about defining abuse of discretion. So 1, they got to show justification. Well, what has to be shown for justification when you're talking about violation of law or policy? It's whether or not the supervisor abused their discretion. What does abuse of discretion mean? We define it as clearly unreasonable, erroneous, or arbitrary. If it comes before this board while I'm your attorney and you've got if somebody can make a showing that they did a violation that's so minimal and so unrelated to anything to do with their employment, I think that I could advise you when it has become clearly unreasonable in terms of the supervisor's decision to dismiss them. So the parking ticket that is on the employee's own time and in their own vehicle doesn't have it lick a connection to their employment with the city, I think you could say that's unreasonable or it's arbitrary. Mm-hmm. So I think we're there, but I'm happy to consider if you don't think we are.
Wonder how the other board members view that.
Well, I had expressed a concern about that as well, but Mr. Henning had pointed out that the abuse of discretion, the change to the definition of abuse of discretion kind of comforted him a little bit more. So I'm less concerned about it after hearing that from him.
I do think it's important that we talk on this point for just a second, because I want to make sure that we're all clear and in the same place with this. The abuse of discretion deals with the department director's decision that a law was violated or that city or departmental policy was violated by the employee. So I don't want to make it sound like that gives this board the ability to decide that his decision about the amount of punishment that was imposed was unreasonable based on the violation of law. Basically, the board's decision whether the department director's decision whether the law was violated, whether a policy actually occurred, is what is going to be subject to that abuse of discretion standard. So I think you're actually, Carter and Al, I think you're very right to point out that if somebody's being fired based on a violation of any law, that it does deprive y'all of some ability to go back and say that we don't agree that the punishment fits the crime. That's why we have the department, the idea of the matrix is going to be so important. Because if somebody's fired because they got a parking ticket on their own time, I hope to God that's not going to be justified by any kind of disciplinary matrix. And at that point, they would not have received due process because the discipline has to accord with the disciplinary matrix. So,
and that kind of case I was talking about, I'm sorry, John, that's the kind of case I was talking about earlier, where I think until in these departments where the requirements of employees to stay, within the bounds of their departmental expectations are complicated, like the APD, the city is at some risk for an argument that says, I didn't get due process because they didn't have a matrix in place that told me that this was such a problem. And so, I think that probably does take care of a lot of the what would otherwise be de minimis cases, like the parking ticket, the speeding ticket, something like that is not going to jump somebody right up to level 5 discipline and dismissal. And once you see that, I think you'll feel a lot more comfortable with that. Short of that, it's not this board's problem that's not spelled out. And that's why, like I said before, Alan, that I feel like, the idea of disciplinary matrix is out there. It's the city's risk until they get those adopted that you may well hear a case that you say, we're not comfortable that you fit that with it, that you got due process because of the discipline that you received.
So let me ask a hypothetical on that, because we said that there's going to be some departments in the city that won't have a matrix, that they're just not, they would be superfluous. Say an administrative employee who, let's just say, got a parking ticket, and their supervisor said, you're not setting a good example for the city of Asheville. You're employed by the city. You broke a law in the city of Asheville, and I'm firing you for that. And what I'm hearing, John Maddox, is you say that because a law was broken, even though we might believe it's unreasonable to fire someone for a parking ticket, that would be not in our sort of bailiwick to assess the unreasonableness of that action because a law was broken. But what I'm hearing John Henning say is, no, if there's no matrix, then we get to apply some discretion or make a determination of abuse of discretion, because clearly that would be a wrong-headed action that any employee would reasonably expect the Civil Service Board to help, find that that's not justified.
And I think you've expressed it exactly right. I don't actually agree with Mr. Henning here, respectfully, that if a department doesn't have a disciplinary matrix, that it opens the door for a finding of some kind of a due process violation if this board feels like the punishment doesn't fit the crime. Because if you read this says that the process is notice of allegations and an opportunity to be heard prior to the decision. And if a department has a disciplinary matrix, then discipline in accordance with that matrix. If not, then that's not, I don't think, part of the calculus.
Well, and respectfully, I think that the whole idea of whether or not we're talking about punishments fitting crimes is a little bit of a canard, because again, what we're trying to do is say we're applying a bottom line definition of what you think is justified, and justified based on a dismissal for any violation of law or policy is whether or not the supervisor abused their discretion, and that in turn is what is clearly unreasonable, erroneous, or arbitrary. And now I don't think that the city can argue, well, none of that actually means anything because number 2 says any violation of law or policy. It all has to come down to a decision that was not clearly unreasonable, erroneous, or arbitrary, or this whole thing is unraveled and doesn't mean anything.
I just still have a problem with it being a bit too broad by saying a law and or any law. And I don't know why we can't say, for example, in C3, employee violated a city or departmental policy, rather than having the law in there too.
I mean, let's be real here. I mean, on any given day, any supervisor can reasonably ascertain that probably any one of their employees at some point during their tenure violated a policy, rule, or code. I mean, that's called life. So if you accept that, then that would allow a supervisor to arbitrarily take employment action just because he or she would have that in their hip pocket. I can find an instance where you were late to work one day, you got a parking ticket, you took home a paper clip that was city property. I don't know what it is. So if we're not allowed to apply some kind of clearly unreasonable, erroneous, or arbitrary standard to those kind of actions, then I would say there's no reason to have a civil service board.
I agree.
We'll never have anything to review.
I think that you can apply a clearly unreasonable, erroneous, or arbitrary standard to the decision about whether a policy was actually violated. I'll give you a perfect example. A department director believes that an employee lied about something. Well, what standard are you going to use to determine whether that was in fact the case? Was that clearly unreasonable, erroneous, or arbitrary, his decision that the employee told a lie about something? This board has come to a different decision in a very high-profile case regarding that. And it came to that decision. And after that, members of this board expressed that they felt like they didn't have good way to judge how they were to weigh the department director's decision. That's why that a policy violation occurred. That's why this exists here. That's the reason for this. And with this in place, hopefully that would come to hopefully this board would feel better about the way that it's reaching its decision in that case.
Alan?
Well, and just adding to Rick's comment, ultimately, these are our rules that we need to adopt. So I think the final decision rests with the board to whether they want to approve this or not. City Council may choose to add that in later on when they get the rules in 2021. But I'm not comfortable with that language. And so I'm really opposed to the use of the terminology of any law.
What if you put charged with violation of any law?
This board, you're absolutely right. This board is free to pass whatever it wants as far as its proposed rule, and then the city council is ultimately the arbiter. So if you want to see something different there, and the majority of the board passes this with different language there, then that is what the city council will consider to amend or adopt.
So instead, what if you put charged with a violation of any law, Alan?
I'd feel a little more comfortable with that kind of limiting to that. It has to be a charge of violation.
So you're talking about, say, charge in the context of, say, the district attorney's office has indicted, or how do you mean?
In my mind, it makes it a little bit clearer that it's not just a violation. I think and Rick, you chime in, I think it may help satisfy some of Rick's concerns, but now how that applies, I mean, you could say convicted. I don't know. I wasn't trying to go that far, but.
Yeah. Understood.
I mean, I think, the way John Henning explained it initially made sense to me. I don't know how to write this down properly, but the idea that if an employee is shown to have violated any law, departmental policy, rule, or code of conduct, that gets you, that's a per se justified. But when we review that, we should not be limited to whether, any policy was violated. We should be able to apply an abuse of discretion standard as outlined in subparagraph 4 to make sure there's some proportionality. And it's not just a matter of opinion of the board or whether we think the decision was right or not, because abuse of discretion means we have to show that it's clearly unreasonable, erroneous, or arbitrary, clearly. So that gets us out of the, we just disagree with the supervisor. But I think until we can have some assurance that my hypothetical that a 20-year employee could be fired for a parking ticket, as long as they can prove that he got a parking ticket, and that we have no discretion to say that that's unreasonable, erroneous, or arbitrary, then, I mean, I don't know how any of us could support that, right?
And I'm going to suggest that it appears that we've got such a difference in philosophy that we probably need to pause on that and try to wordsmith it a little bit to where we all get either somewhere that we're all comfortable with, or that this board is comfortable proposing the rule and then the city council does what they do with it. I had originally toyed with some language that I hope that the standard and what I explained my understanding of it, I thought that was going to get us where we needed to be. I toyed with some language about whether something might be de minimis. It's not something the city's going to be comfortable with regardless. I disagree to somewhat with Mr. Max's characterization of your having substituted judgment on a departmental rule violation, where that I don't know, that oversimplifies the question that was before you, I think. But anyway, I feel like we're going to need a little bit more time to work on some language.
I would support that. Maybe you sitting down with John Maddox, John Henning, and working out that language.
I will say this: if we're not going to take a vote on these rules today, I'm going to ask that the board reconvene next week. Then, because I do not want to leave this for another month. I know the city council doesn't want this to wait for another month. I know that we have employees who have shown some real interest in this, and these we have to have some rules regarding how these things are going to be handled. It's been really difficult to figure out employee relations and how we're going to do. And we have this hanging question of the civil service board's jurisdiction. And we've got to move this across the goal line. So if we're going to take time to wordsmith anymore, I would ask that the board take this up in a special meeting next week.
Well, with all due respect, I mean, we have waited for draft rules for some time, and it wasn't only our last meeting that we got a first cut at that. You all have had some time to hammer out what I think we could have agreed to if the interpretation of this last area was in line with what our interpretation of was. We're hearing for the first time two different interpretations of a section. We're not trying to wordsmith. We're just trying to come up with something reasonable. And until you can address my parking ticket hypothetical, I don't see where anybody on the city council would live with that. My goodness, that any employee action could be taken and the civil service board would have no recourse if an employee got a parking ticket. You know, I mean, it's just, we need to fix that.
Let me walk it back a bit. If you have department directors who are routinely firing employees for parking tickets that they receive not in the context of employment, they're not going to be department directors very long with this city management, or really in any city management that I can imagine, because that is not just and that's not a right thing to do, and they would not be acting in a right way. But we're very rarely having parking ticket kind of claims come before this board. We're usually dealing with much more egregious misconduct. And so there does come a point where we can't, if we're going to have some discretion lying in the hands of the department directors without this board coming back and overruling even what we feel like are pretty clear cases, then we're going to continue to have a difference of opinion.
Alan?
We began this discussion of drafting substantive rules back on November 7th of 2019. And I believe I was serving as acting chair, of that meeting. So I don't see a problem of waiting another month with John Henning sitting down with John Maddox and working out some language that the board would agree to, and then meeting in January and not having a special meeting, let's say next week. I think I'd rather have the two sit down and work that through, and then bring this back at our regular meeting, January 2021. It's been a year.
It has been a year, but in that year, we've dealt with a couple of things that have delayed this, but we have quickly reached a point where it needs to happen. And I know Ms. Whistler's here, if she would like to speak to the fact that the city council needs to see this. And by waiting another month, we have to take more time to get it on the city council agenda. So it would not be just a month-long delay. It would actually be far longer than that. Councilwoman, if you want to speak to that.
So my, it's slated right now, John Maddox, I'm sorry, I'm saying everybody's last name, but Mr. Maddox, it's slated for our January 12th meeting, right?
That was where we would hope to put it.
Right. So, I mean, I would just really urge this board to get to the point, and, maybe it's not next week, but, could you shoot for the first week in January to have another meeting to, I mean, I'm unclear, but I really would like you not to wait, because I mean, basically you would have another meeting,
First week of January is when we're regularly scheduled.
Our meeting would be January 7th, so that'd be the week before City Council has it on the agenda.
Yeah, but we can't. I mean, it needs to be. That would be the Thursday before the meeting. The rules get published. I mean, the agenda, et cetera, and all the documentation gets published the very next day. So that really puts you guys. I mean, under. under the gun. If there's one word change, then it's not going to go on the city's agenda. So could I ask you to move it up like more toward the beginning of that week? Like instead of Thursday, could you do the Monday, January 4th? So that if we do have little minor wording changes after that, it can absolutely get in front of city council. I don't want to, it definitely, I don't want it to go into February.
And when with the lead time the council needs, you have check-ins, you have,
Right.
There's I'm sorry, my mind it's been a long meeting so far. There's the check-ins, there is the discussions that need to happen with council because they have to pass on the final set of rules if they want to see changes. There's a lot of things, and then Maggie has her own set, the city clerk has her own set of rules for when things can be placed on the agenda. And that I know that if this gets kicked into January, it's going to be much later. It's not going to make January 12th. It's just not.
Right. Yeah, if you wait until January 7th, it will not make the January 12th meeting. And I really, if you would, I don't know, whether we need to rent the cage again, but, I really would like to see you guys look at this earlier than that. This has just been hanging out for way too long.
And Vice Mayor Whitaker, am I incorrect? Does the council meet every other week?
The second and fourth Tuesdays.
If we know now that it might be problematic to get it on the second Tuesday, could this be put on the fourth Tuesday agenda for City Council?
Well, it could, but again, a month went by, and we're, frankly, these discussions feel like the same one that we had a month ago. So we really need
a year, but we waited a year to get the information.
Yeah, but at the same time, Carol, we went through several years where the board committed to come up with their own substantive rules. We hired an attorney for you guys to do that, and you never did it. So there was, it hasn't been just a year.
No.
That's not quite fair, but
again, this has been just a while hanging out, and so I just kicking it down for a whole nother month. I really would urge you to look at it before January 7th.
So just real quick, Mr. Henning, if the issue right now that we're looking at for C2 and 3, are we concerned about the law and the departmental policy? If we get back to the thing, maybe we can solve it right now. But is that the biggest issue that we're having right now?
I think the law. Sorry, Carter. I think what we've come to is a little bit of an impasse about where discretion ends for this board. I think you all members are aware of the fact that the act says justified, and that's all it says. And to gloss onto that a rule that says the minute that the supervisor determines that any kind of violation occurred, and as long as that's a fact, you don't get to apply any further question about justification. That is a restriction on this board's authority as expressed under the act. Now, I'm not saying it's entirely wrong to do that. I have tried to see it, and I think we are trying to see it from the city administration perspective. And I feel like we have gone, even with what my understanding of how this rule is going to work was, gone a pretty far distance to do that. So I'm not sure.
Well, I guess my point is, instead of us spending the next 15 more minutes talking about when we're going to have to do this by, why don't we discuss what we're talking about and try to resolve the issue? To me, if we're going to waste the time trying to figure out when we're going to reconvene again, then why don't we just talk it out about what we're trying to resolve?
I will say this, if it's helpful, at least to some of the points that we've discussed here, I would be happy with going to C2. and saying employment action is per se justified upon a showing that an employee violated, and I would take out any law or, take out those words, violated city or departmental policy. I would actually put city or departmental policy, rules of conduct, or rules of conduct. Violated city or departmental policy or rules of conduct.
And just take out the word law.
Any law.
Any law.
Okay.
So we
I would
read
support
But leave
that.
in any, but take out law or.
right. I would say
Okay.
this is how it reads to me now as I've been editing. Employment action is per se justified upon a showing that an employee violates city or departmental policy or rules or conduct or rules of I'm sorry, that is terrible. Editing on the fly with a committee is fun.
Can you repeat that again? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'm
he's
still
going
trying to figure it out myself, Alan. Give me 1 second.
You were taking out any law, though. I thought you
Yes.
said.
Taking out any law.
Okay, I would support that. Any law or.
How about showing that employee violated a city or departmental policy, rule, or code of conduct and received due process as defined by this rule?
I would be comfortable with that.
I'm comfortable with that.
And then in 3, review department director's decision that employee violated, take out a law or, and put in a city or departmental policy, rule, or code of conduct.
Well, because Mr. Maddox, let me ask this as a question. I would presume, and anybody jump in if I'm wrong, that under the code of conduct, that would, for example, if someone was convicted of domestic violence, that the
correct.
code of conduct could come in.
To capture that sort of thing. That's right.
Okay. So then I would support what you just said.
Agreed.
And board members, I feel that's, and where I have always sided with the city's approach to this is I do think a department head, it should be the department head's department to run. And if they're applying, their rules that they decide, this means I really can't have this person. I think that there's sense in finding justification there.
Yeah, I agree. Alan?
Carol, is there consensus among the board with the change that John Maddox just read to us? I just want to be sure that everybody's on board with that.
Well, let me ask you a question because again, I don't want to be sort of the holdout on this. I fully appreciate that 99.99% of supervisors and bosses across the city are going to do the right thing, and there's plenty of due process and review that will help ensure that. But my understanding was that when things came before the Civil Service Board in the way of a grievance, that employee probably felt like there was a breakdown, something went wrong. And it was our job to determine whether the action was justified. Now, what I'm hearing is as long as that the city can show that the individual broke, however we want to term it, policy, rule, whatever, and because of that, not complying with that policy rule, regardless of how significant a rule it was, then we have to find that it was justified. Even if any reasonable person would say, okay, the person violated that policy, but termination of employment was way out of proportion of a response, that we as a civil service board will, as long as we find that something a rule was broken, then we will tie our hands to support the city in that case. And if that's what we want to do, okay, but that's what I'm a little bit uncomfortable with.
Gwen?
Thank you. I realize that I'm inserting myself into this conversation a little bit, so I appreciate your indulgence. I think what we have to remember is, before it even comes before you, that decision had to go up through the city manager. So the assumption that, you're basically making the assumption then that not only is the supervisor being petty, but their supervisor and then the city manager was also being petty. So I guess I'm, from a process perspective, kind of just asking you to sort of think about this. To hold this up sort of feels.
No, I get all that. I agree with all that, but I'm just where my conscience is struggling here is, let's just say hypothetically it was petty, and let's say everyone in the chain of command and everyone in the review process was wrong and they were petty. We as a civil service board wouldn't have any recourse. We would have no recourse. We would have to say we affirm the pettiness, and we would have to tell the public that, we would have to tell the city council that, the newspaper that. So that doesn't feel right to me, that we would have no discretion to overturn something that was clearly unjustified. And I agree that hopefully that day would never come, but if it did come, we as a civil service board would be powerless to act.
Rick, what would you think that the rules should say then?
Well, I like I said before, I don't know exactly how to write it, but in that paragraph, let's see, let me find it here. Okay, in C3, review of a department director's decision that an employee violated a law or city or departmental policy, rule, or code of conduct will be according to an abuse of discretion standard. My interpretation was that as we review that decision, that the department director, that there was a violation that resulted in some sort of an action, that we would get to use a standard of unreasonable, clearly unreasonable, erroneous, or arbitrary. So I think the words are actually there. It's just when I heard John Maddox's interpretation that, hey, as long as you find that some policy was violated, then you're stuck. You can't even get to number 4. Number 4 is like, throw that out. Why would we even talked about those words of unreasonable, erroneous, or arbitrary? Why did we even have the discussion of that? Because it really doesn't matter. You'll never get to 4 because if there was a violation.
And if you wanted to sound like sort of a jurist nerd, there's a phrase, in pari materia, we read things together to make sense of them. You don't read a section of a law that makes another part of it meaningless. And so that's why 3, 4, and 5 knit together to say, this is what we mean by abuse of discretion. And I think that already is taking a substantial step in the direction the city wants to go, in terms of defining, what kind of a violation is going to justify termination.
John, I've got a question.
You got to be more specific.
With John.
In section C1, it clearly states that the city has to demonstrate that what was done was just, right, or valid. Why have we changed what we're referencing to clearly unreasonable, erroneous, or arbitrary? Shouldn't abuse of discretion still be the same, just, right, or valid?
I think what the city has tried to do in the way that this is drafted, and I should say the city attorney's office because the council's not had a whack at it yet, is to better define what that justification in C1 means in the context of dismissal that is based on department head's finding of a violation of law or departmental policy or city policy.
And you're correct, because saying whether something was justified, well, that means that it was just. That doesn't do a whole lot for clearing up what does it mean for something to be justified, just to say that it's just. And that comes from whether something is just, right, or valid. That's a dictionary definition that a court of appeals used in looking at prior civil service board cases. And that is the standard that they would continue to use if it was appealed to the court. So even if the civil service board is utilizing this set of rules to determine whether something is justified, then the courts would use their own, continue to look to whether they think it was just, right, or valid, unless they were to amend that in some future case. It would still be according to that. So even if this board felt like it was hamstrung in a, that 0.0001 case where some kind of petty thing forces the board under these rules, that decision could still be overturned by a court. And if it really is a petty, unjustified decision, then the court could handle that.
And board members, I completely agree that the procedure stays the same as long as the Civil Service Act exists. Your decision that you don't have jurisdiction under this rule is still fully appealable by the employee de novo to Superior Court. They start all over, and that court is going to apply. The Alley case is the one that says justified means justified means justified. That's still what the standard that the courts are going to follow.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure why we were changing the words from what the city had to demonstrate initially to what what we were going to consider was using different words. I mean, they may all mean the same thing, but
this actually came out of after the last big hearing we had, members of the board saying that what does it mean for something to be justified? And they felt like they did not have enough of a good sense of what that word meant, especially when a lot of the case law saying it means, well, justified means justified. And so this is an attempt to bring some clarity around that, not only for this board, but for the city too, because when the city as an employer is trying to make decisions, it needs to know what is with some kind of certainty, what this board is going to interpret as justified. And this does this. I think this creates some bright lines.
okay, I mean, I'll go with that.
I would agree. I'd just go weigh in real quick. I know, Peggy, you're trying to weigh in and nobody's listening to you. But just real quick, I think it clears things up because I know from my first meeting, and it was July of 19 for that case, that we really struggle with, where our hands are tied in trying to figure out whether this was justified or not. And I think this helps clear it up.
Were there any other areas on the proposed draft that people had questions about? Mr. Eskovitz?
Well, I want to be sure we are removing the language that John had talked about previously about violated any law, correct?
That is correct. That is, I've changed that. And
I should say any law or, not violated, any law or.
That's right. I will, before you even vote on it, I can take I've been making edits as we've spoken here. I can share that with you in the chat box so you're clear on what the rule would say.
Okay. And I do have a question on, and probably this may be an HR issue that would help on probationary employees.
So yes, it's not there yet, but I was going to point that out.
Okay.
Some things around that.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think we had gotten to that one yet, had we?
Okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so we talked about probationary employees last time, whether we should have a different period for the police department because we hire folks prior to them even entering BLET, and whether that needs to have parity with the fire department. And after talking with Mr. Henning and based on some language in the act, and this is also some feedback I received from members of the FOP, we really feel like our only option is to create a 1-year probationary period that applies for all employees starting on the date of hire. So that's even when they're in BLET, that time period is running. And it's clear the whole way across the board. So this is when you're hired, you're in a probationary period. If you're rehired, if you've left the city employment, you're rehired, you're going to be in a probationary period for a year. After you're promoted, you're in a probationary period for a year. Now, bearing in mind, if you are fired in that promotion, you still would have civil service board rights. You wouldn't. Probationary employees do not enjoy the right to appeal to the civil service board. If you're a newly promoted employee, let's say you're a sergeant, you become a lieutenant, and you are fired in that period, you would be able to appeal your termination. What D3 says, though, is that if you are promoted, then within that probationary period, you can be demoted and not have an appeal right to the civil service board. That way, if you become a lieutenant, it's just not working out, you could then be demoted, and just because you were in your probationary period, you would not have a right of appeal to the civil service board just on the fact that you were demoted. Does that make sense? And that's actually something that came out of the talks with the employment associations. That was something that they
Mr. Maddox.
Yes, sir.
I've got one question. If you've got somebody that's been working for the city for 10 or 15 years and they get promoted, does that start a new year's probationary period?
Only if they are, it's sort of a limited probationary period. If they are, let's say you're a sergeant, you become a lieutenant, and you're fired, you would have your full appeal rights like a full member of the classified service. You can appeal that to the city manager, you can appeal that to the civil service board. The only thing that you would not be entitled to appeal to the civil service board would be if you were subsequently demoted. Because then it's just not working out.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure because it almost sounded like you were starting another 365-day probationary period if you got promoted. Although, I mean, I agree. It should be a probationary period for promotions because some people can't do the job they're promoted to.
I feel that way.
If you look at number 3, number 2 deals with that, but then number 3 does say that otherwise such employees enjoy all other rights to a hearing afforded to members of the classified service. So I think 3 clarifies your point, Mike.
Yeah, it just, when you sort of lump them all together in 2 and then put another rule out for 3, I just want to make sure that, and I have no problem with the actual promotion being a part of the probation, but they're not like a probationary employee that got hired yesterday.
No.
So that was my only concern.
Alan?
Yeah, John Maddox, I think you did a great job. I'm pleased that you heard the concerns of PBA and the firefighters on that whole issue of time in probation for newly hires, because it does vary within the 2 agencies. But I think you've addressed that concern in D2 and done a good job with that. Thank you.
Were there any other, Mr. Maddox, were there any other portions of the original draft that you wanted to make comments on?
No, I think that covers everything that Mr. Henning and I discussed, and anything that was changed since the last meeting.
Mr. Henning, anything you can think of?
No, Madam Chair, that'd be about it. If the board has consent, it's up to the board of that's your next step. But if you are at consensus about the language, there still is that provision about whether or not an involuntary resignation is something that still this board feels like it has jurisdiction on. So we need direction on whether or not to reapply the language that I had given you on that to the proposed rule.
What's your position on that, Mr. Maddox?
I think our position is that the language as in the current draft is what the city would like to see. That for all the reasons we discussed earlier on, we believe that the bright line rule that this board is not going to consider any action by employees who resign to be before the board following the board's jurisdiction.
And Mr. Henning, any other final words before we?
Madam Chair, if the board is ready to entertain a motion to approve the draft rule and propound it to this city council for consideration, a motion to that effect needs to tell us whether or not you want that language about what I had proposed earlier added back in and an explanation given to the city about it. So I guess a proper motion would be either to approve the rule as revised today, or to approve the rule as revised today with the additional language concerning involuntary resignation.
I would say that the Mr. Maddox has sent the draft in the chat. If everybody wants to take just a minute to look at that real quick.
I'm trying to set it in the chat. It's a little bit unwieldy, but
I have it.
okay, make sure.
It says John Maddox, 4:05 p.m.
Yeah, but I'm not sure it's coming through in the correct way, but.
Oh, okay.
That's right.
One minor thing, Mr. Maddox, if I can just point something out at the very beginning under A. This is completely minor, but if you could, at the end of the first paragraph of A, where it says subject to amendment and approval by Asheville City Council, you could move that to the beginning of the paragraph, because the way it's worded, the way I read the way it's worded, is that the actual Asheville Civil Service Act is subject to amendment and approval by Asheville City Council. It's just a minor thing.
I apologize. Just as you were saying that, a 5-year-old walked through the door, and
hopefully you know who the 5-year-old is. But yeah.
he needed to announce.
Yeah, I mean, you're not calling me that, are you, John?
Gwen, I never would. Could you say that one more time, Carter?
Yeah, it's okay. So in the first paragraph under A, if you just move where it says subject to amendment and approval by Asheville City Council to the very beginning of the paragraph, because the way that I read the way it's worded is that the actual Asheville Civil Service Act is subject to amendment and approval by Asheville City Council. Something minor, but.
I see what you're saying.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Leave it to an attorney.
And I do like the Oxford or the Harvard commas, by the way. I prefer those to be in there.
All right. If I can't give on that, I can't give on anything. Okay, so I've made that change, Carter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
John, on number 3, it looks like RU is.
Yes, that's what I was having issues with the pasting in there.
Oh, okay.
So it should say that disregard that RU and just go with next thing where it says rule or code of conduct.
Well, hearing no further discussion, I'll entertain a motion at this time. Alan?
I would move that we adopt these new substantive rules subject to the changes that John Maddox has just made, and that the board approve them.
It's been moved by Mr. Eskovitz. Is there a second?
Mike, I'll second.
It's been seconded by Mr. Hahn. Mr. Devereaux, how do you vote?
I just wanted to make one point before we vote. Can we have just one brief discussion?
Okay.
So my inclination is to vote against this motion, and I just wanted to explain why, for 2 reasons. One, I was in favor of John Henning's language with respect to the sort of forced resignation scenario, the language that he proposed, although the city preferred not to have that. I thought that language was solid. The other reason is, I mean, I go back to, I feel like that if we worked on it a little harder, and I'll be the first to admit I'm at a loss in this particular meeting to figure it out. Maybe if I had a quiet moment in a cubicle, I could do it. For this paragraph C, I think it would be worthwhile if we could come up with words that said linked abuse of discretion to the notion that an employee who experienced a very minor violation of policy, that would not meet an abuse of discretion standard if the supervisor were to terminate that employee or take some other action against the employee. I'd like to figure out those words. I don't. I'm going to vote against these words because I think it limits the Civil Service Board. It restricts us to not being able to find for an employee simply because some policy was violated. So again, probably not articulating that very well, but I wanted to explain myself there.
Is there any further discussion before we vote? Okay, then just say aye or nay if you are ready to vote. Mr. Devereaux?
Nay.
Mr. Eskovitz?
Aye.
Mr. Hahn?
Aye.
Mr. Webb?
Aye.
And I'll vote aye. So that motion carries with one nay vote. Is there anything else regarding the substantive rules that we need to address?
I would note that Brandon McGaha from the PBA has been patiently listening to us this entire time, and it might be good for the board to hear from a member of the Employee Association regarding
Certainly.
this.
If he has anything he wishes to say, feel free.
Hey, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The first I want to say is that I appreciate all the conversation and all this work that y'all are putting on this. It's really a good thing to hear the city and the board, trying to do what's best for employees. Rick Tullis, of course, apologizes that he cannot be here. He's currently in a rehabilitation center, but he's doing a lot better. So we're very happy about that. One thing I was hearing, typically, as an employee association, we hate, per se language. But in this case, the city has been very good in working with us on their consideration with disciplinary matrix. And a disciplinary matrix, what it is that it gives, for example, let's talk about the parking ticket that's been up for discussion so far. First of all, and I'm sure Asheville has these same policies, not all violations of law are reportable under policy to the agency. And maybe Mr. Maggs can speak further on that if he knows the policy on that. Typically, a parking ticket wouldn't be something you'd have to report to the agency to begin with. Usually that's very high DWI traffic, those kind of traffic violations or misdemeanor violations of law. So I don't know. While I definitely appreciate what you're saying on that, it would typically have to be something a little more severe than a parking ticket to come forward. But even if it did, the disciplinary matrix would classify that somewhere and what type of penalty could be faced for that. A disciplinary matrix takes into account an officer's good work conduct along with the violation, and those two weigh each other out to come up with a high end or a low end of punishment within the matrix. And I'll ask this to the attorneys, of course, but if a supervisor under a matrix didn't properly weigh those, would that fall into the unreasonable, erroneous, or arbitrary, or whatever we're talking about here as far as those violations?
What that would fall into is the due process part of it, because under these rules, we've said that failure to adhere to the disciplinary matrix would mean that employee had been deprived of due process.
Yeah. So, this was all, the PBA, of course, agreed to all this based on the disciplinary matrix. Of course, we'd like to have seen it in place by now, but it's not the city's fault that that's not in place. The city has agreed that they're open to using a matrix. The chief has agreed to that. Unfortunately, Rick, having his medical condition, caused those talks to stop for now. I've been given permission by Rick to open those talks back up with the chief and with a PBA member present to do that. So hopefully we can have a matrix that someone can be approved by the city reasonably soon. But if of course the council said that they would like to see that too before giving their final approval, that'd be great. We hopefully can have something soon for the city to look at. And basically that's all, basically that's the biggest part I want to say. This matrix takes a lot of is a good thing, I believe, that really can work in well with this. But, if for some reason that doesn't get passed and the matrix doesn't come to be, I guess my next question is this commission allowed to look at the rules again if that does not pass, whenever that would be appropriate? Can anybody answer that for me?
And John, if you disagree, I know this board can propose and pass new rules anytime it likes. Those are, though, subject to amendment and approval by the city council.
That's okay. So I like the work that we've done with the city on this. I'm glad. I really appreciate the conversation y'all have had. So our employment association, the way the rules are written, are in favor of them. And we appreciate all the hard work and the city letting us be part of this.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your service to the city. Is there anything else about the substantive rules before we move forward? Okay. Is there any new business to come before the board today? Hearing none, we can move into public comment. Is there any public comment?
No, we did not receive any.
Okay. Is there any informal discussion about future agenda items? Hearing none, I will entertain a motion to adjourn. If there's no other business or announcements to come before the board.
I'd make a motion that we adjourn until our January 7th meeting.
Is there a second?
I'll second it and wish everybody a happy holiday.
It's been moved by Mr. Hahn, seconded by Mr. Eskovitz, that we adjourn this meeting until our January 7th, 2021 meeting. All in favor, let it be known by saying aye. Mr. Devereaux?
Aye.
Mr. Eskovitz?
Aye.
Mr. Hahn?
Aye.
Mr. Webb?
Aye.
I vote aye. The meeting's adjourned with my thanks to everyone for their time and attention to this matter. And also have a very happy holiday, everyone. See you in January.